We're basically paying them a performance bonus for destroying the climate.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 21 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. We begin with some scenes President Obama did not see on his visit to Palestine, Israel. They're from B'Tselem, an Israeli group, showing Israeli soldiers rounding up and arresting a score of young Palestinians, most of whom were under age 12. Then a section on climate, first a report on a rally in New Haven, Connecticut against TD Bank, one of the biggest investors in the Keystone XL pipeline. Then to a portrait of climate activist Bill McKibben, who will be coming to Connecticut and speaking in Hamden on April 18th. We conclude with the end of the speech at the Yale Divinity School by Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow. This is a book about the mass imprisonment of blacks and the making them into a caste of people without rights. In her concluding section, Alexander talks about what ought to be done. We begin in the city of Hebron on the West Bank, where the IDF arrested 20 Palestinians, mostly kids. This is a Palestinian city where a group of several hundred Israeli settlers are determined to drive out 100,000 Palestinians. When President Obama was in Israel, he spoke at the Yad Vashem Memorial and denounced racism. He stayed silent, however, about the well-known open racism shown by large sectors of Israeli society. As an example, the Palestinian-American activist Ali Abu Nima collected a series of quotes on Israeli Facebook pages, comments about a picture of three Palestinians, three young people sitting in a tent. The quotes called for the gruesome murders of these people. The link to the page is on our website. Now to a demonstration at TD Bank against their investments in the Keystone XL pipeline.
Shut it down. Hi, I'm Rebecca from Occupy Hartford. I live in Manchester, Connecticut. I have 3 kids, and the tar sands mean game over for the planet, and I'm not willing to give up until we shut them down.
Hi, I'm here in front of TD Bank to tell them to stop investing in the Keystone XL pipeline and tar sands coming out of Canada because they're ruining our climate, and we would like to breathe more than we would like them to make money.
Resolution in favor of the pipeline yesterday. What do you think about it?
Well, I read that news last night and I kind of had a temper fit because it's just crazy that 62 of the people that claim to represent us in the Senate are actually shills for the oil companies because those are the only people that'll make money off the Keystone pipeline. There'll be a few thousand temporary jobs and 35 permanent jobs built out of this pipeline. So the jobs argument is false. And the greenhouse gas emissions are 5 times what normal oil is, which normal oil, we can't be using that anymore because the greenhouse gas and climate change emissions from that are basically permanently altering our climate.
I understand you're one of the builders of this wall. Could you talk about it?
Yeah, a few people from 350 Connecticut and Capitalism versus the Climate and a few other local environmental groups were trying to do something in solidarity with the tar sands blockade week of action against tar sands profiteers. So we decided to create a wall of resistance with a bunch of different cardboard boxes with anti-tar sands, anti-KXL, anti-TD Bank messages on them to represent all the different perspectives against this Keystone pipeline.
They're digging us a hole. They're digging us a hole. 6 feet underground. Where will our future go? We will lay on our bodies. We will lay down our souls. We will live by much while they dig us a hole. Again.
On Thursday evening, April 18th, Bill McKibben will be speaking at the Unitarian Society in Hamden, Connecticut. He'll be getting the Gandhi Peace Award from promoting enduring peace for his efforts in creating the organization 350.org, an international group that is fighting our march to climate catastrophe. Here, McKibben talks about the amazing amount of money that governments give to fossil fuel companies.
In the last year, fighting things like, say, the Keystone Pipeline. And that's really important work that we're going to keep doing. But we also realize we're not going to win the fight against climate change one pipeline at a time, one coal mine at a time, one fracking well at a time. We got to fight those things, but we've also got to take on the heart of the fossil fuel industry. Can you really believe that we are sending taxpayer money to the richest industry on earth, that we're basically paying them a performance bonus for destroying the climate?
The International Energy Agency said in January that the world gives $409 billion in subsidies for the production and consumption of fossil fuels. Here, in talking about his 2012 Do the Math tour, McKibben outlines the problem. Energy companies have far more fossil fuel than we can ever safely burn.
We're traveling across the country, taking a 21-city tour of America in 21 nights on a biodiesel bus. We're calling this roadshow Do the Math. And the math in question are some of the most important numbers you'll ever hear. It turns out that the fossil fuel industry has 5 times more coal and oil and gas in its reserves than even the most conservative government in the world thinks would be safe to burn. But they will burn it unless we figure out how to slow them down.
Now a bit from McKibben's talk in February in Washington, D.C. at the largest climate rally ever held in the U.S.
For the future that brought you here today, we can see in our mind's eye all the generations to come, and so we know why we fight. We can see the beauty of the world we've been given, the cold of a winter day, the color on an autumn hillside, and so we know why we fight. We know our brothers and our sisters in the poorest parts of the world are already suffering, and so we know why we fight. I cannot promise you we're going to win, But I waited a quarter century since I wrote the first book about all this stuff to see if we were going to fight. And today, at the biggest climate rally by far in U.S. history, today I know we're going to fight. The battle, the most fateful battle in human history, is finally joined, and we will fight it together.
And some of the tens of thousands that he inspired to march around the White House.
This is what democracy looks like. Straight ahead, right? Let's get straight ahead, right?
Bill McKibben will be speaking Thursday, April 18th at 7 p.m. in Hampton, Connecticut. We hope to cover. For more information, see peace.org. Now to the conclusion of the talk by Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow. She had been speaking about the perfectly legal discrimination against ex-prisoners.
So where do we go from here? What can be done? Well, my view is that nothing short of a major social movement has any hope of ending mass incarceration in America. And I know that view is extreme to some, who imagine that surely we must be able to tinker with this thing and get it right. Surely there must be some way to tinker with the machine and get it back humming again, get it back on track. But if you think that just tinkering is necessary, if we were to return to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s, before the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement really kicked off, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. More than 1 million people who are now employed by the criminal justice system would likely lose their jobs. Most new prison construction has occurred in predominantly white rural communities that now view prisons as a source of economic growth, of jobs. And many of these white rural communities have been sold on prisons. Prisons have been advertised as providing far more benefits than they actually deliver. But nonetheless, these communities now come to believe that their jobs, their economies depend on prisons. Private prison companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange, doing quite well even in a time of economic recession. These private prison companies would be forced into bankruptcy. This system is now so deeply rooted in our social, political, and economic structure that it isn't going to just fade away or be downsized out of sight without a major upheaval, a fairly radical shift in our public consciousness. Now, I know that many people today think there's just no hope of ending mass incarceration. Just as many people were once resigned to Jim Crow in the South, which say, yeah, it's a shame, but that's just the way that it is. I find that so many people of all colors view the millions cycling in and out of our prisons and jails as just an unfortunate but inalterable fact of American life. Well, I am quite certain that Dr. King and Sojourner Truth and Ella Baker and the many other racial justice advocates that risk their lives to end earlier systems of racial and social control would not be so easily deterred. So I believe we have got to be willing to pick up where they left off and do the hard work of movement building on behalf of poor people of all colors. In 1968, Dr. King told advocates that the time had come to shift from a civil rights movement to a human rights movement. Meaningful equality, he said, could not be achieved through civil rights alone. Without basic human rights, the right to work, the right to housing, the right to quality education. Without basic human rights, he said, civil rights are just an empty promise. So in honor of Dr. King and all those who labored to end the old Jim Crow, I hope we will commit ourselves to building a human rights movement to end mass incarceration, a movement for education, not incarceration, a movement for jobs, not jails, a movement to end all these forms of legal discrimination against people released from prison, discrimination that denies them their basic human rights to work, to shelter, and to food. Now, what do we need to do to build this movement, to build upon the work that has already been done?
Tell us.
Well, I think the most important thing, is we have got to be willing to tell the truth about what has gone down. The whole truth. We have got to be willing to admit out loud that we as a nation have managed to rebirth a caste-like system in this country. And we've got to be willing to tell this truth in our churches, in our places of worship. We've got to be willing to tell this truth in our schools. We've got to be willing to tell the truth behind bars and in reentry centers. We've got to be willing to tell this inconvenient truth so that a great awakening can begin. Collective action, meaningful collective action, is impossible if we remain asleep, in denial, about what has truly gone down. Because unlike the old Jim Crow, there's no signs alerting you to the existence of this caste system. There's no whites-only signs alerting people to the caste-like system that's in place. No. This system is out of sight, out of mind if you're not directly impacted by it. Prisons are often located hundreds of miles away from home, and the people who cycle in and out of these prisons often cycle in and out of segregated, impoverished communities. And if you don't live there, if you have a decent job, live in a good neighborhood, if you're not directly impacted, you can live your whole life and have no idea what is going on. So if we're going to be serious about movement building and shifting consciousness and dismantling the system, we have got to make visible what is hidden in plain sight and pull back the curtain so that people can have an understanding of what has gone down and the horrific consequences. But of course, there's a lot of consciousness raising, and talk isn't going to be enough. We're going to have to be willing to get to work. And in my view, that means being willing to build an underground railroad for people released from prison. An underground railroad for people who are trying to make a genuine break for real freedom. And that means opening our homes, opening our hearts, opening our places of worship, opening our schools to people returning from prison who need help finding work, getting an education, finding housing, perhaps may even need help getting access to food. But even beyond meeting people's basic material needs, we have got to open our hearts and to show love to people returning home from prison and to support other families who have loved ones behind bars. I find that as I've been traveling around, many people who've been released from prison tell me that church is the last place they'd go. It's the last place they go. So that is the place I feel most ashamed, most shamed, most judged. I've had mothers tell me, well, I used to go to church, but now that my sons are in jail, I don't go anymore. I know what they're thinking about me. We have got to make our churches, our places of worship, places that are safe, welcoming, open to people returning home from prison and people who have loved ones behind bars. Genuinely welcoming. Filled with love. And how do we do that? Well, I think one thing we can do to start making more open, loving places is by admitting our own criminality out loud. Our own. Because the truth is, we're all criminals. We're all sinners. We've all made mistakes in my life, right? Yes. Many times when I'm talking to church folk, I'll say, we're all sinners, and everyone goes, oh, amen. And then you say, we're all criminals. Oh, don't call me a criminal. And I say, okay, well, maybe you never drank underage. Maybe you never experimented with drugs. Well, if the worst thing you've done in your whole life is speed 10 miles over the speed limit on the freeway, you put yourself and others at more risk of harm than someone smoking marijuana in the privacy of their living room. That's the truth. That is the truth. But there are people in the United States right now. There are people in the United States right now who are doing life sentences for first-time drug offenses. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld life sentences for first-time drug offenses against a challenge that such a sentence violated the Eighth Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The U.S. Supreme Court said, no, it's not cruel and unusual in violation of the Eighth Amendment to sentence a young man to prison for the rest of his life for a first-time drug offense, even though virtually no other country in the world does such a thing. So we've got to end this idea that the criminals are them, not us, so fundamentally different than us, and instead say, there but for the grace of God go I. All of us are sinners. All of us have done wrong. All of us are criminals, broken the law at some point in our life. But only some of us are forced to pay for those mistakes for the rest of our lives. After all, President Barack Obama himself has admitted to using more than a little bit of drugs in his life. He admitted in his memoir and interviews to using marijuana as well as cocaine. And if he had not been raised by white grandparents in Hawaii, and if he had not done much of his illegal drug use on predominantly white college campuses and universities, if he had been raised in the hood, the odds are very, very good. He would have been stopped, he would have been frisked, he would have been caught. And far from being president of the United States today, he might not even have the right to vote, depending on what state he was living in. This isn't about the criminals who are so fundamentally different than the rest of us. This is about building a movement that will ensure that all of our children, all of God's children, have a real shot in this life. Don't have their futures erased by mistakes that go relatively ignored on the other side of town. It's about cultivating genuine care, compassion, and concern for all of us, each and every one of us, believing, not just repeating the words, believing in the possibility of redemption, acting on genuine forgiveness, building a society that is rooted in fairness and compassion. But of course, just trying to build an underground railroad and reach out to a few one by one isn't going to be enough either. Opening our hearts and our minds to a relative few, no, we're actually going to have to do a lot more than that. Because if just as in the days of slavery it wasn't enough to build the Underground Railroad and shuttle a few to freedom, you had to be willing to work for abolition. Well, today I believe we have got to be willing to work for the abolition of the system of mass incarceration as a whole. And that means ending the drug war once and for all. Ending it. We have spent $1 trillion on this drug war since it began. Funds that could have been used for education, for drug treatment, for job creation. Instead, we use those funds to pave the way for the collective destruction of entire communities, lives, and dreams. We see a crime. You know, we supposedly criminalize drugs because we're so concerned about the harm these substances might cause people. So concerned what these substances might do to people. And then we end up inflicting upon those very same people far more pain and suffering for the rest of their lives than the substances themselves are likely to cause. We need to ask ourselves, how would we treat people struggling with drug abuse and drug addiction, people like Susan Burton, if we actually cared about them? We would give them a cage and discriminate against them for the rest of their lives? Or no? Would we find more constructive and compassionate ways of responding to them, providing drug treatment and investing in the communities that need it most with education and jobs and health care to meet the needs that they may have? But in addition to ending the drug war, we've got to also end all these forms of legal discrimination against people, discrimination that denies them basic human rights to work, to shelter, to food. And last but not least, we've got to shift from a purely punitive approach to dealing with violence and violent crime in our communities to a a more restorative and rehabilitative approach, an approach that takes seriously the interests of the victim, the offender, and the community as a whole. So we've got a lot of work to do. And if it sounds like too much, if it sounds like it can't possibly be done, I think we ought to keep in mind that all of these rules, laws, policies, and practices rest upon one core belief. And it's the same core belief that sustained Jim Crow. It's the belief that some of us are not worthy of genuine care, compassion, or concern. And when we effectively challenge that core belief, this whole system begins to fall like dominoes. A multiracial, multi-ethnic human rights movement must be born, one that takes seriously the dignity and humanity of all people. And it's got to be multiracial and multi-ethnic, because although this drug war may have been born with black folks in mind, it is a war that has destroyed the lives and communities and families of people of all races. And the racially divisive get tough politics and rhetoric that helped to birth the drug war is now creating another prison building boom, this one aimed at suspected illegal immigrants. So we've got to be willing to connect the dots and build a multiracial, multi-ethnic movement on behalf of all of us. But before this movement can truly get underway, I believe a great awakening is required. We've got to awaken from this colorblind slumber that we've been in to the realities of race in America. And we've got to be willing to embrace those labeled criminals. Not necessarily all their behavior, but them, their humanness. For it has been the refusal and failure to recognize the dignity and humanity of all people that has been the sturdy foundation of every caste system that has ever existed in the United States or anywhere else in the world. It's our task, I firmly believe, to end not just mass incarceration, not just the war on drugs, but to end this history and cycle of caste in America. Thanks so much for having me, and
That's our program for today. Hope to see you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.